So this is part two on what's going on with the U.S. and its foreign policy in the Middle East. So we ended part one. Well, we started part one talking about the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the failure of Operation Desert Claw in 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan. And we had made it all the way through to the first, basically the end of Bush's involvement, Bush Jr.'s involvement in the Iraq War. So we were looking at the beginning of the Obama administration and how they were going to reform things in Iraq and Afghanistan. So as we saw, we had just made it to the end of the so-called Arab Spring. Now the Arab Spring had broader international implications. So one of the results of this was that the U.S. tried to capitalize on the anti-establishment movement that had occurred, not only started in the Middle East, but then expanded to Ukraine. And this is very interesting, and it relates to what's going on in the Middle East today, because in 2013, the beginning of 2014, Viktor Yanukovych, the dictator of Ukraine, was toppled, and this was interpreted by the Russian government under Vladimir Putin as being an attempt to expand NATO eastward, which it had been guaranteed to Gorbachev and I believe Yeltsin by Reagan and Bush, that they would not push NATO eastward. And of course NATO did not integrate Ukraine, but this was seen as a possibility that it could. And it certainly challenged the revolution, who Yanukovych was supported by the Russians. There was great concern that the Americans might put pressure on the fleet base at Sevastopol, which the Russians borrow from the Ukrainians under a trade agreement. They loaned it from Ukraine. So what the Russians did was invaded Crimea with using a new type of military tactic, which has been described as hybrid warfare. And this essentially involved utilizing psychological warfare, psyops, deception, disinformation, and using military forces that are camouflaged, are not wearing national insignia, and not be easily identified in that way, and doing things like secretly landing troops under false flags and conducting military operations disguised as training operations and things like this. So the hybrid warfare, also with virulent control of the media, very important, media propaganda utilization. So the Russians took over Ukraine. Crimea in Ukraine. This prompted the Obama administration to kick Russia out of the G8 and to start embargoing them, which crippled their economy very quickly. However, the Russian army was just beginning a serious modernization phase, and the first test of this, well, somewhat had been demonstrated in Georgia in 2008 when the Russians invaded there, but this was demonstrated again in 2014 when the hybrid warfare was put into practice and proved very successful. Now, meanwhile, the situation in the Middle East had evolved quite rapidly. The government of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who had been democratically elected following Mubarak's ouster, were toppled in a military coup, I believe in 2013, in which the army took control and then formed an interim government, which is now led by Sisi, President Sisi. So the situation in Egypt was evolving very, very quickly. The coup had been, in fact, supported by the U.S. State Department. So they did not like the outcome of the democratic election of the Muslim Brotherhood, which seemed a step backwards instead of a step forward. So they supported the Egyptian army to oust the Brotherhood after the topple of Mubarak. Now, in Libya, as we saw, the opposition to the American invasion and occupation, which was carried out mainly by the CIA with local support, had led to the return of Al-Qaeda to that country, and this produced the And the expansion of al-Qaeda's operations to North Africa and the Horn of Africa, including Somalia, as well as also Yemen. And so this transition although al-Qaeda was still being squeezed in Afghanistan, they were expanding their operation in the Middle East and in Africa particularly. They were still capable of pulling off things like the September 11, 2012 Benghazi attack, which brought down Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and exposed the hollowness of the Obama doctrine in the Middle East at the time, which had been, as we saw in part one of this series, had been constructed on using mercenary soldiers, particularly military contractors from companies like Blackwater, which has become Z, a company run by Eric Prince, amongst other contractors, in the place of military forces. Now, the reason contractors were considered a viable option was for a couple of reasons. One, the death of military contractors is not reported as a military fatality, which means it's not exactly known how many soldiers are dying in combat in a war that's being fought by contractors. This is very appealing to the Democrats because they don't like losing soldiers, as we saw had happened with Clinton in Mogadishu, the Black Hawk Down incident, the Battle of Mogadishu, where the loss of a few soldiers immediately prompted the withdrawal of the American forces there. Meanwhile, however, the downside is that contractors aren't nearly as good or as dedicated or as ideological as your regular army, and you can't ask them to do things like to go conduct coin counterinsurgency operations where you have to go house to house and conduct very robust, long-term operations involving things like close confrontation with the enemy and diplomacy. You can't ask your mercenaries to conduct diplomacy. So mercenaries have a place, certainly. Contractors, they're very useful when aboard merchant ships like the Horn of Africa in counter-piracy operations, because they can prevent pirates, Somali pirates, for example, from hijacking ships. So they do have a place, but in the conduct of coin operations, they're perhaps not the best. So the hollowness of Hillary Clinton's term as Secretary of State was exposed as Al-Qaeda re-emerged in, as we saw, in Somalia, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So this was a serious, and continued to exist to some extent in Afghanistan. So this was a serious issue. Now, the Afghan strategy, as it had been crafted by Obama, had started with a surge, as recommended by Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and CENTCOM's commander David Petraeus. The surge had worked, as they tend to do, had worked initially, but then once the forces were withdrawn, resulted in the return of the terrorists from Pakistan. So, the Waziristan region. Now, an agreement was reached in 2011 in Chicago between the NATO countries that were involved in the Operation Enduring Freedom, and the mission was changed to Operation Enduring Resolve, I believe it is. And Enduring Resolve's operation is to support, this is a NATO mission to support Afghanistan in the long term. Excuse me, it's Operation Resolute Support is the NATO mission in Afghanistan. Operation Resolute Support. So conducting that mission became mainly a NATO problem, which meant the U.S. could withdraw some more of their forces. So Canadians and British were involved there. Other groups, small amounts of Danes and Norwegians and Australians and other NATO forces. And UN coalition forces were there. Now that operation, based on the Chicago conference in 2011, was expected to last until 2025. It would take years to build up the Afghan army to a level where it could conduct operations on its own and prevent the return of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And it was generally believed that eventually some kind of negotiation would have to occur with the Taliban anyway to get them on side. So Afghanistan continued to be a problem and continues to be a problem in the long term, although relatively a minor one in the sense that it doesn't take up nearly as many resources as are being expended in Iraq right now. So Operation resolute support continues to this day with long-term nation-building implications. Now, in Iraq and Syria, as we saw, the American decision not to intervene, despite the crossing of the so-called red line by President Assad when they used chemical weapons against rebel forces, which were backed mainly by the Americans, the implications for this was that it allowed the American-backed anti-Assad insurgency to evolve into what we saw is now described as ISIS or ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and the Islamic State in Libya as well. And so ISIL or ISIS began as a rebel group fighting in Syria, and then evolved, as we saw, to take over Mosul and Raqqa, so in Iraq and Syria, and became a serious threat. They'd moved all the way down to Fallujah, and they were outside Baghdad at one point. Now, they were being countered, the Islamic State, that is, was being countered, which declared itself a caliphate under al-Baghdadi shortly after its creation. They were being countered by Kurdish opposition in the north of Iraq, as well as by the Assad regime in Syria. Also by splinter groups from ISIS, which became the what were called vetted foreign fighters, so trained by the Americans, supposed to counter both Assad and ISIS. And so this became the new Democratic Army, or the Free Syrian Army as it's known, and has gone under many iterations, and they've never really been a very significant force because it's presumably supported primarily by like Green Berets and American Special Forces, not as much by popular support from the people. And also, the Americans never got a no-fly zone agreement through in Syria, which meant that they were never able to really utilize their air power the way they wanted to support the ouster of Assad. Now, to make matters worse, Assad was getting backing from Russia, who were now very concerned about what was going on in Ukraine, and so were concerned about losing their other allies around the world, of which Assad was one of them, since the Russians sell arms to the Syrian government. So, the situation was spiraling out of control in the Middle East. Now, ISIS, however, gave the Americans a fantastic excuse to begin to reconstruct their alliances in the Middle East. And so this is what they started to do under the now Secretary of State John Kerry, who had replaced Hillary in Obama's second term. And Secretary of State Kerry, different approach than Hillary, very active international diplomacy, based and focused on building up the new Iraq coalition, which was to be called the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. Long name for what is often just referred to as the Combined Joint Task Force, or Operation Inherent Resolve, OIR. And Inherent Resolve has a broad mission, which is to destroy ISIL wherever it is. This includes although it's run mainly by Central Command, it includes integration with AFRICOM and parts of Eurocom, since they're working not only with NATO and in Afghanistan, but also in Libya, and to some extent supporting the Saudis against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, as well as primarily in Iraq, but branching into Syria when required on occasion, specifically by air attack. So slowly but surely, countries began to join this coalition. So starting with like the British, who had supported the Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, they joined the coalition. The Canadians joined the coalition under Stephen Harper, and mainly as providing air power support. So the Americans provided most of this, flying out of bases in Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, but the American and their carrier groups. But the other countries began to join, and so the coalition was building up strength, and has generally been held at sort of a core level, operating mainly out of Saudi Arabia as a training force, but using American Special Forces and Marines to secure bases in Iraq. The coalition began very slowly, but started to build up steam. Their air campaign is now quite extensive, and involves like thousands of strikes every month. And by the time Obama left office, was at such a scale that it was comparable to Operation Rolling Thunder during the Vietnam War, in that it's just an immense strategic bombing campaign where they're hitting the capital in Raqqa, the ISIS capital, hitting Mosul very heavily, and the critical city of Manjib, which is a transition point between Mosul and Raqqa. So Mosul and Raqqa provide the two centers of ISIS, and they are connected by this corridor. And so what the Americans were doing for quite a while, mainly in 2015, was trying to cut that corridor with strategic bombing, which they did. The Iraqi army was delivered Russian-built, or excuse me, I believe Sikorsky-built helicopters, which could really put the pressure on ISIS, because the ISIS was very reliant on its oil exports, and these were managed by convoy, moving by convoy. That is to say, truck convoy, and these are very exposed. Since ISIS has no air force, they're very exposed. It has very limited air defense. Very exposed to helicopter attack. So anyway, so the Americans building up their coalition, getting other nations on board to fight ISIS. When the Russians began to intervene late in 2015, to not only under the generally justified by the desire to counter ISIS publicly, the Russian involvement was really to back Assad and make sure that the free democratic forces supported by the Americans in their proxy war did not topple Assad. And this led to the Assad government retaking Aleppo, which is a decisive point. It also led to the Russians really bombing, indeed bombing ISIS quite heavily, especially in Raqqa, and in conjunction with U.S. and coalition forces bombing of ISIS, they were devastating the ISIL petroleum industry and trying to return it to Iraqi government control. So the coalition very heavily, plus the Russians, very, very heavily focused on Syria and Iraq, with most of the fighting being done in the north by in Syria by the Assad regime, and in Iraq by the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, which were sweeping down towards Mosul. Now, just recently, in the fall of 2016, Turkey intervened. There was a military coup in Turkey that was barely suppressed by the Erdogan government, and the Turkish involvement then moved basically to secure their borders, so that the Kurds, who the Turks consider to be, as represented by the PKK, to be a terrorist organization, did not gain too much influence in northern Syria and the border Turkey and Iraq. Now, meanwhile, the organization that's really biding its time here is the Iranian government, because Secretary of State Kerry has conducted a nuclear deal with Iran, in which, to some extent, the Iranians are basically being bribed to stop developing their nuclear systems, of which they had been partially halted by the Stuxnet virus that had been built in conjunction with the Israelis. The Americans delivered to Iran, so this screwed up the Iranian centrifuges that were enriching their uranium. And then this deal was cut, which is supposed to prevent them from going beyond very limited civilian utilization or research, and to prevent them from weaponizing. Now, the Israelis and the Iranians are really the unspoken players here, as well as the Saudis, who I say the Saudis are involved in a proxy war with the Yemeni Houthi rebels, which you don't hear very much about, I should add. Even though they've hit offshore naval forces, which is quite incredible with cruise missiles, the ISIS, meanwhile, is carrying out proxy attacks, terror attacks in places like Nice in France, and in Belgium and Brussels, and taking credit for local lone wolf attacks in the United States and things like this. And meanwhile, Israel is still following trying to follow under Benjamin Netanyahu, hardliner Benjamin Netanyahu, is trying to follow its occupation strategy in the West Bank and development strategy there. And Iran is trying to basically bide its time, waiting for the Americans to withdraw from Iraq. So what happens is the Israelis, who had in 2007, I believe it was, had struck the Syrian nuclear reactor were now basically waiting again for the American administration to change, because the Obama administration had a very tough position on Israel. Particularly Secretary of State Kerry very firmly believed in the two-state solution, which the Israeli government did not, and as a result were airstriking Gaza and heavily bombing them to basically in preparation for expanding their occupation strategy in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So when the election was lost, when Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump, this meant that there would be no return to the Clinton doctrine, and the Obama doctrine of sort of light ops, airstrikes, but special forces, psyops, cyber warfare, things like this, would now be replaced with a much more forward strategy, which we've seen reflected by the appointment of people like at first Michael Flynn, U.S. Army intelligence officer, to National Security Advisor, General Mattis, who had been Marine Divisional Commander in the Operation Iraqi Freedom and had now become Secretary of Defense, as well as General Kelly to Homeland Security Advisor, and then Flynn, of course, as recently was replaced by H.R. McMaster, who wrote Dereliction of Duty and had fought in the first Gulf War. So this is a much more forward group of people running the Trump foreign policy we expect, and Trump has said in the campaign that he would resolve the Middle Eastern situation. Now, this is a very complicated situation he has to resolve, and the defense review that's being conducted right now by the Mattis DoD is supposed to report pretty soon on what they're going to do in Iraq. But they've got some issues. Well, so right now the Mosul operation is stalled. The Iraqi army is having trouble getting through Mosul. It's a very deadly battle there. The U.S. is moving more and more forces into the Combined Joint Task Force, and the Americans are taking a more frontline position. One of the last acts of the Obama administration was to use B-2 Spirit stealth bombers to hit a target in Libya, suggesting that the Libyan campaign is still ongoing. Afghanistan is still predicted not to finish, until 2025, if ever. And in Yemen, like I said, we've seen an acceleration as well, where the Houthi rebels have now attacked American warships with cruise missiles, in addition to Saudi warships. So that situation is continuing to develop. The Russians put their entire northern sea force, including their only aircraft carrier, into the Mediterranean off Syria to conduct airstrikes, and then withdrew it. Claiming again that the second time that they're going to withdraw from their operations in Syria, although they probably won't. However, it's very costly to conduct those operations, and they're still being embargoed by the Americans over the Crimean occupation, which the Russians have said they will never return, and it's unclear what the Trump administration will do about this, despite their connections with the Russian government. So the situation is very, very tenuous right now. The Combined Joint Task Force will undoubtedly be successful in the long run. Their air power is too immense, and they're being supported now by the potential for serious ground force intervention. So they will succeed. The question is, what will they do immediately after this? Because they'll have a situation where the Assad government will probably survive in Syria, especially backed by the Russians. So they'll have to come to a diplomatic negotiation there. The Americans may decide to put forces into Syria to create so-called safe zones, or to set up a no-fly zone or something like this, because one of the things that's really aiding the Syrian government is their use of their air force, which is a huge advantage that the Free Syrian Army doesn't have. However, the Trump administration has just recently stopped providing CIA backing to the Free Syrian Army, so it looks like that will be finished, which means that they may have abandoned Syria to the Russians. Meanwhile, the Flynn administration, when he was National Security Advisor for a month, was very heavily anti-Iranian, had been on record saying that they should remove the government of the Ayatollah, and had before he left office had stated they had put Iran on notice that because the Iranians had conducted a ballistic missiles test, supposedly with technology from North Korea, believe it or not, and were stating publicly that they were going to now begin to rebuild their nuclear facilities because they were expecting these invasion overtures. So the situation is that the Iraq War is going to be re-accelerated, and Afghanistan will again become a bit of a sideshow.